Good evening, welcome to TDM Talk Show. I'm your host, Kelsey Wilhelm. Our guest tonight is Tim Unwin, Chairholder of the UNESCO Chair in ICT4D at Royal Holloway, University of London, and Honorary Professor at Lanzhou University. In addition, he's part of the steering committee of the World Economic Forum's Internet for AI initiative, and on the digital advisory panel for the UK Department for International Development, among many other roles. Mr. Unwin is a distinguished author, having written or edited 15 books and more than 200 papers and other publications. He's traveled over 40 countries for research, but over the last 15 years has concentrated his focus on information and communication technology for development, in particular using ICTs to support poor and marginalized communities. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So I wanted to start off right at the beginning. You have a long history of interest in technology, and you started programming at a very early age. What sparked that interest?
I think I must be a bit of a geek. You know, I just enjoyed programming in Fortran in the mid-70s, which seems an awfully long time ago, now probably long before you were born. But I was using that for my research and sort of modeling settlement systems and using card decks and everything. And I just kept that interest. And in the subsequent years, in the 90s, I was very much working in some of the poorest countries in the world. I cut my teeth, I think, in rural India in the mid-70s, working in the poorest parts of the world. And a lesson I learned from that was that development isn't really just about economic growth, because that will leave the poorest behind. Development is, as much as that, about reducing inequalities. And so by the end of the 90s, I became really interested in how can we use this amazing kit, which I enjoyed, to try and reduce the differences in the world and help some of the poorest and most marginalized communities.
And I mean, you've obviously been through China, given your honorary professorship at Lanzhou University. What brought you to Macau?
Well, you were very kind in your introduction. I'm sure I didn't deserve everything you said. But
that's only part of it.
But I'm also on the International Advisory Board for the United Nations University Computing and Society Institute, which is situated here in Macau, doing some amazing work just in this field on how technology can be used to support some of the poorest and most marginalized communities. And it's the only sort of UN base here in this part of the world, and a great opportunity to integrate some of the work that's been done here in China and in Macau with the wider UN system.
Now, in terms of what ICTs are, it's become a very catchphrase, let's say, but not many understand, information and communication technology, what it is and how it's evolved. So from your point of view, you've seen much of its evolution. What has it reached to now, and where did it come from?
Well, I take the where it came from first. I mean, as I mentioned, I was sort of programming, and you had to put a whole deck of cards in, and if one card, a tiny bit was wrong on it, you had to it was rejected, and you had to run the program again the next day. And then, if you think back to really the late 90s, early 2000s, there was this. Everyone was excited about the new millennium. It's really hard to think about that now, but there was this belief that technology could really transform the world. And at that time, many leaders of the big private sector companies were beginning to think, okay, how can we use this to make a difference? Yes, to expand our markets, to be able to get cheaper labor, but also, how can this transform education? How can it transform health? And so I was really, really lucky in the early 2000s to have been asked to lead our Prime Minister's initiative, which was about creating partnerships between governments, private sector, civil society, to help transform education in Africa through KIT. And that was initially computers, and then by the later in the 2000s it came to be phones, perhaps mobile phone a bit like this one. But now we have mobile phones like that. And what's the difference in what you can do with 2G and 4G or 5G that we're now going to be getting? And I think that shows how we get increasing inequality in the world. Many parts of the world, half of the world still doesn't have access to the internet. And so those who do, who have a smartphone, they can do incredible things, whereas those who don't have a phone at all, or who just have an old phone like this, it does have advantages, but that's inequality, and I'm after inclusion. So it's how we can use the latest technologies. And I think there are exciting things. We're now in the world of artificial intelligence, robotics, and how can we use that so it doesn't just benefit the rich. That's what I'm interested in.
So on the ground, seeing ICT4D, ICT4 development, what does that look like on the ground?
All too often, it looks like dumping kit. So we have a lot of programs where governments have been convinced that laptops or tablets will transform learning in schools. And so this is about just sort of massification, giving some countries, Mauritius, for example, where every child at a particular grade has been given a tablet in school. Now, all too often, no consideration is given to training the teachers and actually using that kit to improve learning. And I've been doing some work for Save the Children and UNICEF, two of the biggest children's organisations in the world, and really coming back and looking at whether this has an impact. And in recent years, I've been working much more on, I guess, the negative side, because if we don't mitigate the potential harm that this technology can do, particularly with children, then it's going to be not advantageous to them. So the idea that we find ways through which the technology can support them, and it can, but actually preventing them from harm. And the evidence actually is pretty balanced. We've had about 15, 20 years of everybody saying this technology is going to improve everything. And only now are people beginning to realize, in the richer countries of the world as in the poorer. I mean, I'm sure you know that many of the Silicon Valley successful businessmen and women now don't allow their children to have access to digital at school. So if they're doing that, and yet we're selling tablets and encouraging poorer parts of the world to take on board this kit, we need to reconsider things a bit.
Is that mostly in the hands of the educators, or where does the parent side come into play?
Good question. It depends, I think, a little bit on which part of the world, but in many African and South Asian countries, some of the biggest corporations are very actively promoting this will transform your education system, this will transform your health system. Yes, it can, but only under the right conditions. So I think in state-run schools, parents across the world generally have little control or little say. In the richest countries of the world, there are initiatives to help parents understand how they can work with their children so that the dark side is prevented as far as possible. But online paedophilia, for example, the addiction, which in some parts of the world is now seen as a very serious problem, the amount of time people spend on social media and the bullying that happens, there is a dark side as well as the undoubted benefits.
Now, definitely, I was going to ask you before, do you think that this increasing access to technology, which ideally through things such as social networks, messaging apps, which are increasingly becoming more and more like social networks, is that actually breaking the human bond, or is it making it stronger?
I don't think it's an either or, it's a change, and we're interacting with each other in different ways. And I think it's a personal belief. I still believe that the physicality of a human interaction is really, really important. The technology can't replace that. A parent giving a child a hug, or a loved one a hug, that is fundamentally different from just the mediation through technology. But a lot of my work at the moment is about thought experiments and getting people to question actually where this is going, where the interaction between the machine and the human is going to finish up. And I am very much encouraging open debate about that. And I tend to be a little bit provocative, but encouraging people to think of some difficult scenarios and working out, well, what do we actually want?
Aside from the world of science fiction, as we've seen a huge boom in popularity of, let's say, the comic book movies and increasingly more sci-fi focus on the mass Hollywood productions, multi-million-dollar Hollywood productions. How out in the open is the dialogue about integration between man and machine?
I think most people still see it as science fiction, but it is actually happening. Now, there are companies that are developing biotechnology and are seriously saying that in 20, 25 years, we will average age live to 125. There are people experimenting in the integration of machines and humans. There are some companies that are offering their staff the ability to be chipped because that will enable them not to use their fingerprints when they go into particular rooms, to pay for their lunch in the canteen. These things are happening now, and my concern is if we don't question them, think about some of the ethics, we will are slowly creeping into a world where we're all going to become cyborgs.
Now, are you in support of or against the idea of people being chipped, especially within institutions?
Yeah. I think there needs to be choice. Personally, I'm not a great fan. But let me give you one scenario. And a lot of research has shown, for example, that if when children are born, and particularly in areas where the health services are not very good, and the midwife or somebody there has a mobile app that they can take all the health details of that child, the weight, and they can record what vaccinations they've had, and they can measure that regularly. And so if the weight goes down, the mother can be given advice about more nutritious food. Consider that, and then consider what I've just said about humans being chipped. We chip our dogs and cats. So why don't we chip children at birth with all of this data already in their bodies? Why don't we allow refugees to be chipped so they can have all their education data in their bodies, and that can then be validated without all their records in their past university or school in their home country have been lost. And so I think you can actually argue there are benefits. Personally, I think that's what might say the thin end of the wedge. It's a way through which in time we could be increasingly controlling humans and tracking them, and companies are doing that already. Anyone who has a Fitbit, they might as well have that in their body.
There was a recent case of I believe a US military person who was using a fitness app, and that was used to find a secret military base. So there are obviously dangers to it. One of the more kind of visible figures out there who has different ideas and who talks openly about changes within technologies has been Elon Musk, who just recently seemed to have a bit of a contradictory stance in that he says his neuroscience company wants to achieve a symbiosis with artificial intelligence, even to the point of having chips and tiny wires implanted in our skull within a decade. But he compared that to our current use of smartphones. Now we've obviously seen the physical evolution of the smartphone itself, but what level does that take us to?
I think that takes us to this fundamental question: is it already too late for us to prevent the human race from becoming cyborgs? And some people see that as extreme. Some people say, well, humans have always used tools and technology, and having them in the body is not actually going to be any different. My own personal view is it does make us fundamentally different. And Elon Musk has been, I think, in many of his statements, as you've pointed out, a little ambivalent. At times, he seems to be saying this is truly dreadful and we need to think about it and decide whether we want it. At other times, he is supporting technology that is very much driving that agenda forward. I really believe, and we could have a long discussion about this, but there's very little that humans do now that machines can't do better. And we're generally talking about machine additions to humans. Now that's probably the wrong way around. If machines are already doing things better than we can do in many cases, the worrying scenario is going to be when we start adding human bits to machines. So there are two ways of seeing cyborgs: machine humans or human machines. But I would just like to encourage everybody to think, well, is this what they want? And there are many people who do. My feeling is that the majority probably don't. And what do we do? How do we limit some of the amazing things that scientists and companies are doing? Going back to my interest in sort of ICT for development, for the poorest and the most marginalised, another thought experiment I do: who is going to be chipped first? Is it going to be the rich and the powerful who will have the chip to get all the benefits of the experience, and the mass of the people won't? Or will the rich and powerful remain totally human and chip labour and get labour to be controlled?
That's a very deep topic. What about somebody who is a physical example of the integration of technology with themselves as a person? We have Stephen Hawking, who without the computer that he developed would not have been able to communicate with the outside world. In terms of that scenario of human beings adding components to machines, do you think that at all towards the end, Stephen Hawking was not completely in control of what was being said?
I never had the privilege of meeting him, so I don't know. But a lot of my work is actually with people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. And one way I like to put it is that people with more disabilities have vastly more to gain from this range of digital technologies and ICTs than those of us who have fewer disabilities. Mm-hmm. We all have disabilities, we all have abilities, but it is quite amazing what this technology can do.
Yes.
The blind can communicate with the deaf through speech to text, text to speech technologies, something simple like that. I look forward to when the smart car technology creates smart humans. So if you think about it, blind people mm-hmm. can drive mm-hmm. themselves just in the way in which smart cars can, for example. The challenge is for the mass of the population, not, I guess, kind of privileged people like Stephen Hawking, is that this technology costs. Mm-hmm. So any new bit of technology that isn't built and designed inclusively mm-hmm. for everybody is going to marginalize those who can't use it. Mm-hmm. And they have to use assistive technology, which is somehow to get them back to the point where the rest. So actually, much of his technology was assistive. Mm-hmm. But yeah, your average person in a poor country who has a disability, it's, I think, unfair for them to have to pay more to benefit from technology than a person with fewer disabilities.
No, and someone with a disability could be somebody who does not have as much economic possibilities, somebody who is, like you mentioned, a refugee, mm-hmm. somebody who actually suffers a physical disability. In regards to your work in Africa itself, mm-hmm. and in regards to developing countries and the need for this to conscientiously be done within education, the implementation of ICT, China is obviously a powerhouse for tech manufacturing itself, but it's also, through its Belt and Road Initiative, going out on a massive scale in terms of investing in infrastructure, which then theoretically will allow will allow access to ICT technology, or at least the infrastructure that can help facilitate it. Mm-hmm. So what is your view of the Belt and Road? Is it the chicken and egg? Does the infrastructure have to come first before ICT can be fully, properly implemented within these developing countries?
You've combined quite a lot of questions there. I'll try and disentangle them if I may. I think I'm correct that in 2011, China really began its first sort of international development white paper. And that focused, as you rightly point out, very much on infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And I think the Chinese recognized that many other bilateral and multilateral donors had rather moved away from big infrastructure projects. And so this was a niche that they could get involved in and do good and build contacts with many other countries of the world. China has internally very, very much developed these infrastructure projects, which made a huge difference. Mm-hmm. I think many of us in the West don't fully appreciate all the work, for example, that China is doing on sustainable technologies, mm-hmm. green technologies, a real world leader there. Mm-hmm. So that was, I think, part of the background. And then you had the new initiatives, which are focusing very much on this and bringing in infrastructure. And there are international organizations that work closely with Chinese companies like Huawei, ZTE, in rolling out the technology. My own work, recently I've done quite a lot of work in Pakistan and seeing the China-Pakistan economic corridor with mm-hmm. 3 routes going down from northeast Pakistan down to the port in the southwest, really bringing infrastructure and the potential for huge development. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of technology, and you mentioned kindly the work I've been doing with the World Economic Forum's Internet for All initiative, mm-hmm. that argues that we need sort of 3 or so main things. We've got to have access to the technology first. Mm-hmm. You've got to have the skills to use it, and you've got to have the content and material that will benefit you. Mm-hmm. So I very firmly believe that without the basic access, you don't even reach point one. And we've got to remember that half of the world is still not connected to the internet. And until that happens, we're now talking about 5G in the richer parts of the world. And again, I come back to my, 2 phones. If you could do some things with this, but nothing like as what you can with this in terms of content acquisition, in terms of using all of the apps. So you have to begin with access, but people need to be able to afford it, and they need to have relevant content. And in many, many parts of the world where there is connectivity and access, poor people either don't know what they can do with it, they don't have the skills to use it. Perhaps more importantly, there is little that is of use to them as they see it. And those designing the technologies don't begin by saying and listening to the needs of poor people. All the people at these international gatherings know very little about poverty. And I have a pet project that I've been trying to get funded, which is actually sending some of the best researchers in the world in this area to spend time living with poor people and then working with them to develop new technologies. Nearly every initiative is about, I exaggerate, but only a little, about people concocting a new technology in a lab and then piloting it with poor people. And it's for poor people. Everyone talks about we give this technology to them, we have developed it for them. Very rarely do people say we're developing it with them. And language is just as important as the kit.
That's very interesting, because developing it with them means that you're truly seeing their needs.
Yes.
But it seems like there can be a widespread kind of blanket approach towards approaching what we see as less developed communities and telling them, you need this. Yes. So within the context of something like the internet, which has its obvious pros and obvious cons, should people be allowed unhindered access to the internet?
I think
Do they need it?
I mean, if we're all going to become cyborgs, of course we need it. But I actually was doing some lectures here recently, and I've raised the issue. You mentioned social media. I mean, many people here and on the mainland in China use WeChat for everything all the time. Yeah. Amazingly, at a lecture last night, people thought they could survive without it for a day. I really question them. In my experience, it's pretty much impossible. And I have friends who try and give up using connectivity for a day or two, and they find it almost impossible. Okay. So we need actually to do that as part of life. But one of the things you're touching on is that I think in a world where we have smart cities, not smart villages, in a world where everything has to be immediate, in a world where all knowledge and information is on the internet, it's a serious disadvantage for people not to have it. Yeah. It's impossible not to interact within the current job market in particular. But does a farmer in rural India or rural Africa who enjoys walking over a hill to talk with his neighbor and sees that as part of life actually need a mobile phone? It would be much quicker for him to have a mobile phone and just speak. But he or his wife or his daughter actually might get more out of life just by walking and seeing nature and feeling part of it. I think there are very challenging issues that we need to think of. And I think perhaps people may feel from this interview that I'm being very negative. I'm not at all. I believe passionately in what this kit can do, but I also know the dark sides, and I also want us all to reflect and reach communal decisions about what we want for our societies. It's not up to the elite to tell the poor what to do. Now I had seen one of your previous interviews in which you'd mentioned that technology itself doesn't have the power on its own to restructure society. This was within the context of the labor market, but outside of the context of the labor market, we've already seen technology shaping our society in a way, but your argument also that we've already seen technology change how the labor market works. Yeah, it's not the technology. That is what I call an instrumental view of technology that says that this by itself has power to change things, that the internet by itself has power to change things. I think that is a false way of looking at it. These technologies are designed by people, not yet by machines, for a particular purpose. So the technology doesn't have power by itself. The technology is used by those in power to deliver particular solutions. So you could argue that one of the reasons why technologies are being developed to reduce the amount of labor required is because the owners of factories, the owners of the means of production, if you like, want to reduce the impact of labor, reduce the potential of strikes. If you get rid of labor completely, you don't have to worry about strikes. You may have one or two people working for you. Their productivity, economic productivity, goes up massively. Many people may be out of work. There is a vision of the future where actually people won't need to work. The machines will do it all. Whatever will be following the states that we now have will tax those companies to give a living wage or a larger wage to the mass of the population who can choose to do what they like, and they will then use those tokens, maybe not even money, to purchase from those companies. So you could have a virtuous circle. That is a bit of an extreme view, but again, we need to think about these. And the United Nations and the UNU is involved in that, are considering that the role of artificial intelligence in the future, how that impacts the future of work. And a group of us, so about 21 UN agencies, are then working together about exploring what the implications of that are for education. And of course, education shapes the research and development, but it also needs to help people either deal with this new world in which many of us won't be working, or have the abilities to take on new jobs. And I find it incredibly exciting. Lots of people are worried by the implications for work, but it isn't that different from the 19th century when factories were introduced. It's the same basic ideas. I disagree with those who are talking about a fourth industrial revolution. The drivers of change are very much the same. The capital is interested in reducing labour costs and extending its market. That is what's driving this now. That's what drove factory production in the 19th century.
But we're reaching the point where machines will no longer be designed of and conceptualized by humans themselves, but by machines already. So doesn't that kind of bring us to a tipping point in which if the person designing the functionality of the machine is no longer thinking like a human, then the human element no longer needs to be a part of the component?
And that goes back to what I was talking about, cyborgs and machine humans and human machines earlier. I think it's interesting that there is a lot of work that's now being done to show that the algorithms that are being used in AI are actually not that good at distinguishing certain things. We're in the 16 days of activism for violence against women, for example, and it's very clear that differentiating genders isn't always easy. Differentiating people of different colours isn't always easy, because the algorithms focus on one particular part of that. I think you are absolutely right, and we do need to decide as a society whether we want to add bits of humans to machines to make the machines better, and we want the kind of future you are suggesting. Personally, it kind of scares me, but I'm old enough that I probably won't have to live through that. It's if you have children, it's your children and their children. But we in this generation need to consider these moral questions. They're much, much more important than things like climate change. And we're not having these open debates. We believe this kit is good. We believe technology is somehow always good. It's not good, it's not bad. It's created for particular interests, and we need to understand those interests. Look at the richness of the owners of some of these global tech corporations. And yes, the kit can be used by poor people to enhance their lives, but these big moral questions also need to be addressed. And it's not you or me who should make those decisions. We need to encourage that public debate of the extent to which we're going to have those machine humans or human machines.
But that public debate, for example, something like climate change, you previously mentioned that if we had been talking about this more often, if we had the data that we knew now, a couple centuries ago, we would be in a much different place now. The people who are developing AI and who are developing some of the most advanced forms of, let's say, what can lead to us becoming cyborgs, the average person on the street doesn't have access to that information. They don't know enough, pardon me, to be able to start a public debate based upon current facts. How do we go around that?
I would go even further. I think they're sort of prevented from having that debate. That the opportunities for the debate are being closed down. And blockchain is a fascinating example. There are lots out there. There's artificial intelligence for good. There's now blockchain for good. And blockchain has many great things about it, but it is still, in most cases, a kind of solution in search of a problem, and certainly in international development, and how it can help the lives of the poorest and the most marginalized. So I think occasions like this, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here and in Macau, but occasions like this are chances to open up the debate, to try and say these things, and I hope I have, in relatively simple terminology, not to be too geeky. We have to begin by recognizing that the technology can be used for either good or for bad. So raising the moral potential of the discussion. And people tend to respond better to emotion than facts, emotion and rational argument. So raise these emotional issues using scenarios. And rest assured, I don't believe that some of the scenarios that I've mentioned earlier are right. But I use them as a way of getting people to question. I think I'm often asked about this technology and the lives of poor people, say, well, poor people have much more important things to think about, like where the next meal is coming from, where they can get some food, where they can get shelter. And one argument that people in technology use is, well, this kit can help them do that better. True, but we need to then build on it and say, well, actually, how far do we want this to be? And I think going back to education, which is perhaps the area I know best, as I said, we've had everybody saying technology is good, it's transforming education for the better. Now we're getting more research, more understanding of the negative side, the way in which kids get addicted, they get subject to cyberbullying, pornography, and the way in which one final example. Everyone's talking about smart homes. And I've just been thinking, I've resisted this, although I do have a little bit of smart things in my home. But the idea is that you can control everything in your home. So when you're driving, you can set the heating on so to come on in half an hour when you're back. And you can then sit down on your sofa and lie back, and you can have your little pet robot bring you your drink, soft drink or alcohol. You can control the lighting, you control the sound, everything. You're not getting up to do it. So we're going to be having, the humans who are left will be these over-bloated, unfit people who just... that's not a life I want. And I think we have to talk about those things. Say, is that what you want to be? Some of us want to be that. Definitely, but have the public debate, and that's one of the reasons why I feel that governments still have a really powerful, or regulators do, in mediating public discussion. We must never forget the private sector companies are doing this to make a huge amount of money. They are making a huge amount of money, the biggest corporations in the world. Do we want them to control our future?
Well, hopefully they won't.
Well, your view, but...
Thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Open up the debate and have people thinking about not only the present, but the present within the future context.
Yeah, and let's, those of us who may be listening, let's make that debate active and encourage people to think about these issues. Thank you once again.
Thank you. That's all for TDM Talk Show for this evening. We welcome you back next week with more TDM Talk Show. Thank you.